All this stuff that we talk about on this show, there is life after death. That life is like this. Spiritual things work in this way. How do you know if any of it is true? I mean, if you read something online about coral reefs in the Red Sea, you don't just have to take their word for it. You can go there. You can dive in, see the fish, and feel the water. But with the spiritual world, you're relying on the testimony of one person, like a Swedenborg, with no way to verify it, right? Actually, no. While the travel path isn't as clear as booking a flight to Cairo, people do make the trip to the other world more often than you might think. How do they do it, and what's that trip like? Glad you asked, and we're going to take a look at it tonight. Stay tuned. All right, everybody, welcome back to another episode of Swedenborg and Life. This is sort of an episode that's going to tie a lot of things together. We're looking at modern spiritual experiences today because this whole show is based on this idea that there was this long, extraordinary series of spiritual experiences that we've had cataloged and we're reading through and learning from. Is it still happening today? That's what we're going to look at. And is there similarities? Is Swedenborg part of a larger whole, or is he this anomaly, this little subsection of human experience? My name's Curtis. I'm going to be the host tonight, as I am every night. And you guys can be part of the show. Get your questions, comments, and that kind of stuff. We'll answer them at the end of the program. All right. So let's take a look, man. Yeah, if this is really the stuff we're talking about on this show, if it's actually the truth about life, like if the stuff Swedenborg is describing is the underpinning mechanism for everything, it should show up for more people than just him. You should have other people being able to access something of this, right? We're going to take a look at those other travels tonight and sort of where they intersect and what can we learn about it. The point of everything, of all this knowledge is, can we learn anything about life that's going to make life better for everybody, right? So let's see what we can do tonight. We're going to go through a bunch of acronyms and we're going to start with STE. So what do those three letters mean? I'll give you a hint that they're a category of spiritual experience. Now, of course, spiritual experiences don't have natural categorizations, but we people have put some terms on them to try to bring some organization and some structure to these reports that people have. So that's all I'm going to give you. Fortunately, someone else is going to tell you, and actually someone who's more qualified than me to talk about it. This is Dr. Erica HYATT. She's been on the show before. She's involved with research into spiritual phenomena like this, and she's going to explain what we're dealing with here with the STE.
So STE stands for spiritually transformative experience, and that is exactly what you would imagine it to be. It is an experience that can happen to anyone at any time in their lives, at any age, at any time of day. It is something that happens to you that changes the way you think about yourself, the world, and people around you. And usually it involves feeling connected with something bigger than yourself. And that could be something specific, like an angel, like a departed loved one. Or that might mean something like feeling connected to what's called source, energy, or some might define source as God. So it happens to you, and it is significantly transformative in that the way you see the world and really existence is changed really forever. It can be religious, it can be a secular experience. There's something called Kundalini awakening, where it's just the sensation of energy that is uncoiling in your body. And then it could be something like an out-of-body experience, where in order to feel connected, you actually have to shed your physical attachment to your own body.
So spiritually transformative experience is the broadest category. It's the umbrella that we've stuck over everything, all these different accounts of all these different kinds of things that people go through, right? And we are actually going to do something here that's really risky, because a lot of people might get really mad. We're going to recycle a clip. Last week, we put this one up, and it just happens to fit exactly with this episode too. This is a recording of somebody's spiritually transformative experience? Well, their description of it. We got it. It was a person who contacted us via Facebook. Her name is Anya, and she had this experience, and it wasn't, prompted by her being in physical danger, as some of the things we're going to talk about in the next section are, but yet it had a lot of elements like that, and it transformed the way she looked at life. So those are the two elements I thought we'd play. It's just a quick clip. This is not her reading it, but she wrote it, and we had someone else read it. So this is an example of a spiritually transformative experience, and one that happened just a little while ago. So this is something that's happening to people today. So here's hers.
It was 1987. I was 32 at the time, knitting a scarf on a beach in Italy, when suddenly I got a life review. It was an inner body experience, I think. I relived my whole life until then, and I really don't know how many seconds or minutes. However, in my case, I only saw the good I had experienced and that had been given to me. I then realized how important a smile, a hand on a head, or a kind word is. It was made clear to me I shouldn't ask anything for myself anymore. Then I got all information there was to get. It seemed I knew everything there was to know, even to the extent of why at some point so many millions have to die at times. And finally, a voice in my head spoke 3 times, every time increasing in loudness, service to humanity. Never in my life have I felt so at peace with myself, with life, and with everybody on earth. And never before or afterwards have I experienced such feelings of happiness and gratefulness.
It sounds pretty cool, right? Never before or since experienced the feelings we all want: happiness, gratitude. So that was in the late 80s, or early, I forget what you said, in the 80s, and that is actually when people stopped having spiritual experiences. That's the last recorded one. No, I'm just kidding. They're happening all the time, all over, but that was a cool modern example. And this is just one person's. These are a lot more common than most people realize. And to prove it, we've got another person who's dealing with spiritual experiences. This is actually an author. His name is Graham Nichols, and he has written a couple books about spiritual or out-of-body experiences, and he's had a number of those experiences himself. And this is a recording of him. I got to interview him, and he's talking about a spiritually transformative experience that he had when he was young. So here he is explaining what happened to him.
Well, I guess the first one was the one as a very small child. I woke up in the middle of the night, walked out of my bedroom into the hallway of the apartment I grew up in, and there was a very tall figure standing in the doorway that led out of the apartment, and I remember being quite scared, but not because anything particularly frightening happened, but just because it was quite, beyond anything that had happened to me before. And I think even as a small child, 5 or 6 years old, you still already have some kind of a framework of what's possible and what's real, etc. And it was obviously not my family. My whole family are quite short, so it was definitely not someone from the family or anything like that. So I just remember kind of going down onto sort of ground level, I think, to get some kind of sense of solidity, because I was frightened by what I was seeing. And then I remember turning towards my parents' bedroom to try and call out to them, but I couldn't really muster any sound because I was too emotionally engaged in what was happening. And then I turned back, and the figure was still there. It didn't really do anything. It just sort of looked at me, and there was this sense that beyond the doorway there was a kind of it seemed like it was leading somewhere. So it seemed like it was on a threshold between this level and another level, or something like that. I mean, obviously it's a very long time ago, and my memory is quite faded of all the details, but it was very powerful in terms of what it actually led to, because I think after that I just had this openness to the possibility of other levels and different kinds of experiences and things like that. So when at my school people talked about spirituality, and growing up in London's very multicultural, and we had lots of different beliefs and religions and ideas going around, and my school would often we would celebrate Diwali, the Hindu festival of light, and we would also celebrate Christian festivals and also, Muslim festivals. There was a whole range of different things that we would mark. So I think it just sort of opened me up to maybe knowing to some degree what these different cultures were talking about, and maybe the underlying principles behind a lot of these religious ideas that obviously over time become a lot more about. What was great about Swedenborg in many ways, because he reconnected with the direct experience of these things. In many religions that's been lost, unfortunately, and I think Swedenborg was very conscious of bringing that back in and trying to work on those kinds of principles.
So pretty remarkable that it happened when he was a young child. You must think like whoever's, distributing spiritual experiences, oh no, not until they're a certain age. But I wanted to play that clip because it was not only the experience, but he talked about the impact it had on his life, specifically how it changed his life and sort of opening him up to these kinds of possibilities. And so that is the nature of the spiritually transformative experience. So for you guys, you're walking around meeting people. You probably met a number of people who have had their lives transformed by these experiences. If you haven't had it, this could be a part of why the world is like it is, right? Hopefully, probably not as big a part as it would be nice to have it, since it seems like the experiences generally always have a good impact. I don't know if I've heard of a negative spiritually transformative experience that had a negative experience on, or a negative impact overall. Some have frightening elements, but it seems like it always leads to something good. So it seems like you'll be glad if your next door neighbor who just is moving in had one of these, because it seems like it makes you cooler and nicer. So not only are people these days having them, this has happened all throughout history. I mean, from accounts we've had, including with none other than Emanuel Swedenborg. And we're going to get into one of his spiritual transformative experiences. Oh, but before, I want to say, if you want to hear more from Graham, check out this link. Of course, you don't want to type that in, but you can click it if it's there, or just open the description up. That we did a text interview with him, and he describes actually 2 other spiritually transformative experiences that he had. That was just the first one. So there were sort of 3 major points for him and other experiences. So it's definitely worth looking at. There's more in there about what his experiences are like, how he goes about them, that kind of thing. So with Swedenborg, you talk about someone who's having a lot of experiences. Swedenborg got to the point where he was having them so often that he could write enough that you could make an entire web show where you talked for an hour every week about them. That's what we did. And yet, he had to have something that kicked it off, right? What we're going to listen to here is a reading of what could be called Swedenborg's spiritually transformative experience. So this happened in a period where he had been doing a lot of work, putting in a lot of spiritual work, meaning that he was pursuing what you would call spiritual growth, or we could call it personal growth. It's not necessarily that mystical. It's trying to be a better person, push back the negative human tendencies, follow your religious devotion. He was trying to really make this connection with God and see something greater. And he was journaling. He had that's now published as Journal of Dreams. And this was an experience he had where it really, things switched into a new gear here. So this is Swedenborg's notes. This is not something he published that was found afterwards, so it's pretty raw, which is nice. This is what he went through, a very special experience that he had.
At 10 o'clock I went to bed and felt a little better. After half an hour I heard some racket under my head, but then I thought that the tempter left me. Immediately a shiver came over me, starting from my head and spreading throughout my body, and I also heard some rumbling coming in waves, and I realized that something holy had come over me. I actually fell asleep, and about 12 o'clock at night, or maybe it was 1 or 2 in the morning, such a strong shivering seized me from head to toe, like thunder produced by several frontal systems colliding, shook me beyond description, and threw me down on my face. And when I was prostrated in this way, I was clearly awake, and I saw that I'd been thrown down. I was wondering what this was supposed to mean, and I spoke as if I was awake, but I found that the words were actually put into my mouth. And I said, "You, Almighty Jesus Christ, who of your great mercy has seen fit to come to so great a sinner, make me worthy of this grace. And I clasped my hands together, and I prayed. And then a hand came forth between my hands, and it pressed my hands firmly. In a little while I continued my prayer, and I said, "You have promised to give grace to all sinners. You cannot do otherwise than keep your word." In that same moment, I found myself sitting in his lap, and I looked at him face to face. There he was, a countenance of this holy appearance. All was of a manner that I cannot even describe. He was smiling at me, and I was convinced that that's what he looked like when he was alive. He spoke to me and asked if I have a health certificate. And to this I replied, "Lord, you know better than I do." And he said, "Well then, do it." And that is, as I inwardly grasped it, "Do love me," or "do what you have promised." God, give me grace to do it. I found it at that moment beyond my power, and I woke up shuddering.
We just dropped there in the middle of an entry, actually. So if you want to read more of that story, there's the before and after. Look up Swedenborg's Journal of Dreams. You can get it at Swedenborg.com. Now, you may or may not have noticed near the end that Swedenborg is saying that he's face-to-face with God. And God says to him, "Do you have a health certificate?" And I'm going to tell you, in brief, this story. Why did God say that to him? This goes back to Swedenborg when he was younger, before he had had any spiritual experiences. He's just a scientist and guy trying to get his education, doing all this stuff, right? He was on a boat going from one part of Europe to another. And when the boat got into the harbor, they all had to stay on. There was a quarantine because there was disease. I think it was the plague was going on. And so they had to make sure that nobody on the ship had the disease before they let him out. Swedenborg, you noticed in there that he was like, "Oh, I'm such a sinner." He was a bit of a hothead. When he was younger, he thought he was really cool because he was so smart. And he thought, like, I don't need to put up with this. So he actually jumped ship, as it was called. Like, he snuck out of the ship into the town, and he got caught. And they knew, hey, you snuck out before the quarantine was over. You could have gotten us all sick. So they actually put him on jail, and I think he was facing death there. But he had some connections, so he called people. They pulled a few strings, and they got him out. Right? The point is, when God shows up, God says to him, "Do you have a clean bill of health?" He's referencing that episode in his life, which I think is fascinating. Okay, needless to say, an experience like that was not like it redirected Swedenborg. He had already, by that point in his life, was on this path of trying to, do what was right and seek what was higher. But that was sort of one of the major opening points, or this is when the gates started to really open. He started to go into his fully spiritual phase that we pull these quotes from when we read them here. So thought you might think that was interesting. If you didn't, well, you're going to think this next section is interesting because it's so great. Let's check it out now. Our next acronym, NDE. So this is one that you're probably all familiar with. Actually, I shouldn't say that. If you're not familiar with it, that's totally fine. This one is more well known than the first one, though. I'm not going to explain it. Legally, by my contract, I cannot explain acronyms with 3 letters. I'm going to leave that again to Erica.
So the near-death experience, or NDE, is something that really came about with the publication of Raymond Moody's Life After Life. And he found, interviewing people that had returned from major episodes close to death. So we're talking about things where their hearts had stopped or they had stopped breathing. So example, drownings or cardiac arrest. In incidents where these people were close to death or actually had died, they were experiencing ineffable, so beyond words experiences that challenged how they thought about their lives. And often the characteristics of this would include being sent down a tunnel of light where they were visited by deceased loved ones or guides, and those guides could even take, in later research, we saw things like forms of animals for people who didn't have religious associations or affiliations. Small children, for example, might see bumblebees as their guides or familiar objects. So you're going down a tunnel of light to a place of familiarity, met by someone that feels safe and trusting, and they're telling you that you've actually crossed over. And that's where the term kind of crossing over that's been frequently used comes from. You've crossed over from life to death, and you would actually reach a point of transition that was signified by a bridge or a river, somewhere you had to cross where you were told or you instinctively knew that you could not come back to life after you've gotten to that point.
So the near-death experience, this is probably the most famous term for spiritual experiences. As she said, Raymond Moody made it up. He was a doctor, released this book, Life After Life. This is really when you first started to have categories for spiritual experiences rather than just saying, oh, you were messed up from medication, or, oh, that's weird that you say that. This is when it started to be like, oh, you had the near-death experience. And these are generally, spiritually transformative experiences that are triggered by your life being in danger, by intense physical stress. And so in the book where he introduced this naming of the phenomenon, life after life, he has a whole section we're looking at here on Swedenborg. You see these two different sets of paragraph. One is something that Swedenborg, a common element in near-death experiences, then where Swedenborg says the same thing. So when he first wrote the book, and there wasn't Swedenborg Foundation telling him, you better do this. He just found Swedenborg and thought, there's a lot of similarities here. He included this whole segment on the similarities between Swedenborg and the modern near-death, what these people now, hundreds of years later, are reporting in hospitals, at the scenes of accidents when they have these sorts of experiences. So I want to highlight one more connection between Swedenborg and the modern NDE, and that comes from professor and psychiatrist Bruce Grayson. And he was a guy who made up this thing that was called the Grayson Scale. When he was doing research, this is from the IANDS website, International Association for Near-Death Studies. You can look it up there. He, in an attempt to sort of research this stuff or write these things down in an ordered, structured way, he made up this questionnaire, and you could see it at the top there. There's 16 questions. Did you have this element? Did you see a bright light? There's like a thing worth 0, which says, no, I didn't. 1 is, yes, I did. 2 is, I saw it and it overwhelmed me. So through this, you would kind of get a categorizing system for these. So I thought that it would be fun to take some of Swedenborg's experiences and put them through the Grayson Scale. So do you want to do it? No, we're going to do it anyway. All right, so here is an experience that Swedenborg had. He says, one time just after, this is an experience in his book, True Christianity. You can download this and all the books for free. Just to click on them or look in the description. Go to Swedenborg.com, free ebooks, free PDFs. Anyway, he says, one time just after I woke up from sleeping, I fell into a deep meditation on God. Looking up, I saw above me in heaven an oval of intensely shining light. As I fixed my gaze on it, it gradually receded toward the sides and merged into the periphery of my vision. Then behold, heaven opened up to me. I saw magnificent things and angels standing in a circle on the south side of the opening, talking to each other. Because a burning desire came over me to hear what they were saying, I was allowed to hear it. First, the sound of it, which was full of heavenly love, and then the conversation itself, which was full of the wisdom that goes with that love. They were having a conversation about the only God and being in partnership with God and about the salvation that results. What they were saying was ineffable. Most of it could not be expressed in the words of any earthly language. Several times before, however, I had been in gatherings of angels in heaven itself and had been able to join in their conversation because I was then in a state similar to theirs. This enabled me to understand them now and to select from their discussion a few points that could be expressed in a rational way using the words of earthly language. So we could only take a little bit back. I was thinking if you're watching this on your phone, we really nailed you with the size of that text. So that's his experience. And if we look at the Grayson Scale, there's 16 questions on it. There's 5 of them that he checks the boxes for. Of course, we can't ask him about all these, but just in this description, did you see, feel, or surrounded by a brilliant light? Check. Did you feel separated from your body? Check. Did you seem to enter some other unearthly world? Check. Did you seem to encounter a mystical being or presence or hear an unidentifiable voice? Check. Did you see diseased or religious spirit? So that would have ranked pretty high on the scale, especially if we could ask him a few other questions that are on it. Let's take a look at another experience that he has. Once when I was meditating about the Lord's second coming, there suddenly appeared a flash of light which forcibly struck my eyes, and I therefore looked up, and lo, the whole heaven above me appeared luminous. And there from the east to the west in a continuous strain of glorification was heard, and an angel stood near. After this I heard the sound of singing, and more deeply in the east I saw a flashing of light more brilliant than the former. And I asked the angel what the glorification there was. I looked again into the eastern heaven, and it was lighted up from the right side. The illumination extended to the southern expanse. I heard a sweet sound, and asked the angel what it was pertaining to the Lord that they were glorifying there. Hearing and understanding these things, my heart... So we cut out a little part to make it not too long, but he got the gist of it. Hearing and understanding these things, my heart greatly rejoiced, and I went home joyfully. And here I returned from the spiritual to the bodily state in which I wrote out that all this I had seen and heard. That's True Christianity 625. And that checks a lot of the boxes we saw before, but in addition, there's this one, a feeling of joy. Here he describes, and he just writes, I had a feeling of joy. But what he must have actually been feeling was probably really, really mind-blowing stuff, right? So that just adds that new wrinkle. And this third one is another, speaks directly to another question or another checkbox on the Grayson scale. This can be understood from what was said earlier. And so we lost our text there. We're going to get back in a second. What I'm going to say is we're jumping right in to his spiritual experiences. So it's going to be right in the middle of something, and, that kind of stuff we just do. So we're going to jump back in. 1, 2, 3. This can be understood. Sometimes you just got to reboot, man. That's the only way with computer stuff. This can be, so that all that ramble I did in there was to say, that's why it's saying this can be understood. We don't know what he's talking about, but you can go look it up. This can be understood from what was said earlier about the closed door between the heavenly paradise and the earthly one, and from very many other circumstances. Okay, throw that part out, even though it's cool. I can also testify that a veil being drawn away was displayed before me, and then I saw truth clearly in light. In fact, even my ocular vision became sharper, which amazed me. So he's talking about even his physical vision. So that would check this final box here, where your senses more vivid than usual. So I just find it interesting that this guy, and looking at near-death experiences, came up with this scale to catalog these things modern people are telling when they get sick or when they get hurt. And that Swedenborg is describing these same elements back in different circumstances in a different time period, different format. But so there may be some kind of convergence there too. Also, see this picture here, man? There's light in that picture. And all across all kinds of STEs, NDEs, there's light. And Graham Nichols was talking to me a little bit about light that he sees during his experiences. So I wanted to get a little on that from him. So here it is.
Well, the crystalline light is one that's fairly common in my experiences, and one that I guess is the most related in a sense to spiritual levels and spiritual experiences. And I will experience this crystalline light both in the physical environment, the physical world, and also in those more spiritual levels, the Summerland levels, those kinds of areas. And the best way I can describe it is that it's like experiencing all of the colours of the rainbow, like you're seeing through a prism, but at the same time it's a pure white or pure golden crystalline light. So it's interesting because it's kind of multiple qualities all at once. It's like you're experiencing the light, but then the light has some essential quality or meaning, or almost like a consciousness to it, almost like an awareness to it. So it's like that light represents something far deeper than just the quality of illuminating the scene, for example.
Light that represents something far deeper. This is a foundation. This is a load-bearing beam in Swedenborg's accounts of the structure of the spiritual reality. Secrets of Heaven 4:530. And also I like that Graham said that it's like a consciousness, because Swedenborg has some interesting things to say about that. Since understanding and wisdom from the Lord is what appears as light to the eyes of angels and spirits, and since it also illuminates their intellect from within, the colors are essentially changes in or modifications of understanding and wisdom. So that it's an excerpt from something talking about the origin of colors, but you see his definition of spiritual light is wisdom. You know, that's what you actually does the same thing as physical light here. And then further, Secrets of Heaven, the glow of this light, this spiritual light, does look like the light of the world, but it is not like it because it is not earthly but spiritual. It contains wisdom, so that what streams down before the eyes of the inhabitants this way is pure wisdom. So the wiser the angels are, the more brilliant the light they enjoy. So those, I don't know, but to me it seems like you saw Graham and Swedenborg. These are two different people describing the same thing in different ways, in my humble opinion. All right, are you hungry for letters? Let's get 3 more in there. It's time for OBE. So you know the drill by this point, all right? Erica HYATT, take it away.
An out-of-body experience is a kind of experience where you actually physically, it's hard to say physically, but there's a sense of physical detachment from your body. So most commonly this happens in times of sleep, but it can also happen when an individual is going through trauma, a very frightening experience, something bad is happening to them, something highly pleasurable is happening to them, or sometimes it takes people totally by surprise. But the main component of the OBE is that you have the sensation of being out of your body. For some people, they might just hover above their bodies. They might have the sensation of looking at their bodies below them as they're in rest or repose. And some might actually take off and travel. They might go down the street. They might be able to travel across the country. Anita Moorjani, when she was having her near-death experience, this is the author of Dying to Be Me, she was able to leave her body and actually have a sense of all things happening at the same time and to be everywhere at the same time. So she was able to see her brother on the airplane as he was rushing to her side as she died. And she was also able to see from a different perspective her husband at the bedside. So an OBE can encompass all of those experiences. You get out of this duality of mind-brain that I have to be in my body in order to actually experience life. And you're able to see from multiple perspectives. Some people even go to higher realms. They'll have accounts of going to hell, or going to heaven, or going to other planets, but they are detached from their bodies. Eventually, they come back in and they settle back in. And actually, that can be pretty jarring for them as they attempt to reintegrate into a body that now feels awfully restrictive once they've escaped and had a chance to travel around as almost a disembodied spirit.
So, as you can tell, as she's saying, the categories are a bit fluid. The out-of-body experience is essentially, you're traveling up out of your body. Doesn't need to be a near-death experience, but sometimes people like Anita Moorjani are having near-death experiences and they have out-of-body experiences. But there are some distinctions there, and that's why we wanted to look at this one separately as it is. So essentially, out-of-body experiences is exactly what it sounds like. True Christianity 76. This is Swedenborg describing an out-of-body experience that is triggered by what he's thinking about. One day I was in a meditation on the creation of the universe. Angels who were above me to the right noticed my meditation. They were looking down like, oh, look what Swedenborg's meditating about. The region had a number of meditations and debates on that same subject. Therefore, one of them came down and invited me to join them. I came into my spirit and accompanied the angel. Something that I find interesting about that is it's sort of because he was thinking about this thing. It sort of put a beacon on him that angels, which are, these people who had been thinking about the same kind of thing or were involved in that, knew he's there. I feel like it's sort of like on the web, what you're searching for, what you type into the bar. People oh, this person's interested in this, so they get connected to a body of knowledge. You know what I mean? That there somehow, when you're thinking about something, you attract that kind of spiritual company to you, right? So he was focusing on something, and that led him to a particular out-of-body experience. And here's a story that Graham Nichols told, where he had a similar sort of thing. He was thinking about a particular location, and that affected his out-of-body experience.
Well, I think one of the consistencies across descriptions of out-of-body experiences in pretty much every culture and every writer that I've come across is this idea that where you put your attention is essentially where you go. It's like your awareness, your consciousness, where it's focused will actually materialize to some degree. You'll actually find yourself drawn to that particular location, and that happens in many of my experiences. A recent example was where I was feeling a bit homesick for London, because I now live in Tallinn in Estonia, and I was thinking about London. I started to go into the out-of-body experience, and I found myself around 10 meters above the top of the HYATT building in London, which is I think it's now the tallest building in Europe, or near the tallest buildings in Europe. I didn't know anything about this building at the time, so initially I was confused and didn't know where I was, and thought, I don't even know if this is London, for example. But then other landmarks and other things around proved to me that it was London, but I didn't recognize this building at all. So then after the out-of-body experience was over, it was interesting, because then I could look it up, and I found that it had just been opened to the public when this experience happened. So that was kind of a verification, again, a small verification that there was something objective to it. I can't be sure that I didn't hear about the HYATT or see the HYATT at some point unconsciously, but as far as I know, I had no awareness of that building. So that's an example of how your awareness can be drawn there. But I think in this whole area, I think people, for example, especially when there's a strong emotional bond or a love between individuals, that's often when people will be drawn to each other in the out-of-body experience. So that's very common as well. You might go to a loved one. This is often reported in near-death experiences, and also when people actually die, they'll maybe the living person, the living relative, will see an apparition of the person who's just died and things like that. It seems to be that as we're human beings and we're most drawn to other people and relationships, it's most likely and most common in a way that we're drawn to other people. But I think whenever there's an emotional factor involved, that's when it's most likely, because if you love a particular place and or you've got a history there, or you've got some background there, then it's far more likely that you'll be drawn there in the out-of-body experience as well. So yeah, it seems to be linked to consciousness and emotion.
So he's saying that across a lot of experiences, this idea that love attracts you to think, if you have an affinity for something, someone, someplace, you get drawn there when you're in spirit mode. And this is also one of the basic principles of spiritual physics, as Swedenborg describes it. That's how that world works. You don't believe me? Divine Providence, 29. Got ya. In the spiritual world, all union takes place by means of attentiveness. When anyone is thinking about someone else because of a desire to talk with her or him, that other person is immediately present. They see each other face to face. The same thing happens when someone is thinking about someone else because of a loving affection. But in this case, the result is a union, while in the former case, it's only a presence. So, love brings you closer. Thinking about people gets you together, but love is what creates unions. So, while we're on the subject of Swedenborg, why don't we look a little farther, because Swedenborg was having out-of-body experiences, but he actually was going far enough that he was having what I would call in-body experiences. And I'll explain what the heck that is through this quote, True Christianity 157. Since our spirit means our mind, and that's a distinction Swedenborg makes, the conscious part of you is the spirit. Therefore, being in spirit, as the word sometimes says, he's talking about the Bible, refers to the state of our mind when it is separated from our body. In this state, the prophets saw the sort of things that exist in the spiritual world. Therefore, this state is called a vision of God. At those times, the prophet's state was like the state of spirits and angels in the spiritual world. In this state, our spirit can move from place to place while our body stays where it is, as is also true of our mind's eye. This is the state I myself have been in now for 26 years, with the difference that I am in my spirit and my body at the same time, and only sometimes out of my body. So Swedenborg had a wide range of different kinds of experiences and continual experiences every day. Sometimes he would just, pop out of the body, zoom around, but other times he was in the body, still in his body, and able to look around and see the spiritual world. And here he explains that a little bit more here in Heaven and Hell 441. While I was walking through city streets and through the countryside, absorbed in conversation with spirits, it seemed exactly as though I were just as awake and observant as ever, walking without straying though all the while I was in visions. I was seeing groves, rivers, mansions, houses, people, and more. After I had been walking for some hours, though, I suddenly found myself back in consciousness of my physical sight and realized that I was somewhere else. I was utterly stunned by this and realized that I had been in the state of people described as being led by the Spirit into another place. For as long as it lasted, I was not thinking about my route, even though it might have been many miles, or about the time, though it might have been many hours or even days. I was not conscious of any fatigue either. This is how we can be led by ways we know nothing of all the way to some predetermined place without straying. Okay, so it probably made it seem like, so that's an extreme thing where he could be moving through the world, like walking, basically sleepwalking through the world, but competently while he's off in the spiritual world. That wasn't the experience he was normally having. His normally was this out-of-body, in-body experience. Like he could be, if he was sitting at this table, he could be talking to me, hey, but he could also be talking to angels that were over here. He could do it sort of at the same time. But he sometimes went as far as to have that. So there's a lot of different kinds of spiritual experiences you can have. If you didn't, if that was the point of the show, to say that, we said it. There's a lot of different kinds. So I heard that in the chat room that's going on while we're taping this live, people are hungry for more letters. That's what they said. This is going to fill you up good. Here comes part 4. Okay, so maybe you knew the other ones, but maybe this one's stumping you a little bit. What could that one be? SWA, what could it be? Well, I'll let Erica take it away. What's that? We don't have Erica? Oh, that's because we made that one up. SWA is Spiritual World Awareness. It's not an actual category. It just, we wanted all these things to look good together, right? These little things. So spiritual world awareness is this section where we're going to talk about how close it is and different ways that we can kind of tap into it. So let's start in Divine Providence 3:17, where we get at why. As far as our spirits are concerned, and it is our spirit that thinks, we are in the spiritual world. We're in it. We're in it. That the conscious part of you is obviously hugely impacted by the physical world, but we're also impacted by the spiritual world in our thoughts and feelings. The ways we think about things, the way we feel about things is affected by both worlds. So we're already there, right? That's why it's useful to have some awareness of how that world works. You can understand your own psyche a little better. Secrets of Heaven 6:408 and also Spiritual Experiences 3:04 is talking about why we could be in a world like that but not really know it. While we're living in our body, we have a distinct sensation of what goes on in our body, but a very dim sensation of what goes on in our spirit. Worldly cares stand in the way as long as we are in our body. When the human mind is absorbed in worldly concerns, it is as though it is let down and falls from the heavens. I have also learned through experience when I was being led around in the heavens here and there, which took place during a time of wakefulness, that when I lapsed into thoughts about worldly matters, Then what I had seen in the heavenly habitations at once disappeared. So those who let their thoughts drop into the world fall from the heavens. So let's talk for a second about what worldly concerns are. So in those two, there's this thing that's translated there as worldly concerns. It seems to me it drops you out of the spiritual scene. So what is that? It's not necessarily things like worrying about. Like thinking, well, it's trash night tonight, I should take the trash can out. That's not going to kill your spiritual connection. Worldly concerns are more like ego concerns, like worry about reputation. Also, getting excessively worried about material sort of things can be another one. But in general, it's more negative sort of ego stuff that shuts you off. Because as Swedenborg said, we're supposed to be immersed in this physical world. That the way to be spiritual is to participate in this life and do it honestly and faithfully. You're not supposed to retreat from it. Some people can get good things out of that, but it's not like being in this world and figuring out how to provide for people who are dependent on you is somehow an impediment to the spirit. That's actually an avenue to the spirit. So that's a little bit on worldly concerns. But yet, even with that, even with us living in the world, people do have these experiences, as we've been seeing. And I wanted to learn a little bit more about how do people achieve these experiences? They're happening all over. And how do people in different cultures get at these experiences? And do they come with intent or not with intent? So I sat down with author Richard Smoley, who's been on our show before, and he talked a little bit about how these experiences show up sort of around the world and what people do to get there.
Well, there are basically two kinds of spiritual experience. One is solicited and one is unsolicited. There are a lot of spiritual experiences that just happen to people. Sometimes people are just walking down the street and then some, light goes on in their eyes, or they suddenly see the whole cosmos in all its glory. And no one really knows how that works. Now, then there are the other kinds, which you could call the solicited kinds, which I think of what you've been talking about. They are experiences that people try to have. And there's one approach, which is some type of meditative experience. Now, meditative experience can be quite a bit of different things, but it usually involves some kind of concentration that allows the mind to still itself and open up to deeper dimensions. There are a lot of ways that this can be approached. Breathing practices, regulating one's breathing, is a very time-honored way. And you'll remember that Swedenborg, in his youth, seems to have discovered something like this almost on his own. And to what extent that had anything to do with his later spiritual experiences and visions, I don't really know. But it is very intriguing that it does seem to resemble, certain breathing practices, pranayama, as the Hindus call it, that are practiced today. You can go to any yoga class and, practice them at least in kind of a light form. So there are breathing practices, meditative practices. The other, another important way which people have spiritual experience is by some extreme circumstance. That is to say, some kind of long fast, isolation, anything that kind of breaks your connection with the day-to-day and breaks your connection with the, shall we say, with your physical embodiment, or at least loosens it, opens you up to this kind of experience. The American Indians would have the vision quest, in which, a young man usually would go out for several days completely alone without any food. And he would just sit there and, through this fasting and through prayers and through being in complete solitude in nature, he was often granted a vision. That was one way of doing it. There's the shamanistic way, and shamans seem to have used two different approaches. One is some kind of psychotropic drug. Now, the psychotropic drugs, the psychedelic drugs that we're most familiar with are like LSD and ecstasy, which are synthesized, right? They're artificial. The shamans, of course, didn't have that, but they would use certain plants, particularly mushrooms. There's a South American psychedelic drink called ayahuasca, That's actually gotten kind of trendy even in the United States. And these often, again, combined with isolation, fasting, some sense of religious preparation or devotion, can induce these experiences. If you're doing this, you're trying to induce an experience like this, your mindset and your attitude are the most important things. You are essentially closing yourself off to the rest of the world for a certain amount of time, and you're opening yourself to an experience of the sacred.
So that's how people go about it. And how did Swedenborg get to where he was? There's not a ton on it, but there's a couple things that you can pick out. As Richard mentioned, breathing. Breathing was a big part of it for him, and he talks a lot about the way that the lungs and the spirit are connected. Here's a little basic quote he gave about it. Heaven and Hell, 446. The deepest communication of our spirit is with our breathing and our heartbeat. Thought connects with our breathing, and affection, an attribute of love, with our heart. And we had a bunch of quotes about this breathing spirit connection. And so I took that one, which was the most simple and straightforward, and I took this next one, which was just off the deep end, like the most bizarre sort of one, unless you're used to this kind of stuff. And this is a quote about a time when he was just fully immersed in this spiritual experience and had this connection with breathing. So let's read it, man. Spiritual Experiences 494 to 495. Later, I learned to what provinces those singing angels belonged, namely the purer ones who are angelic, belong to the pulmonary functions. Something I was allowed to experience, that is, that they controlled my lungs for a while, which was done so gently and pleasantly, and indeed internally, that I scarcely felt any breathing of air. I felt it from the center to the outside, for the lungs act into all parts of the body, the inner and the outer. Besides these, there were some who controlled my outer breathing, which I could feel very well, and they are spiritual, and therefore more noticeable. Moreover, those choirs devoted to the involuntary action of breathing are distinct from those devoted to the voluntary action of breathing. Those devoted to the spontaneous action are governed by feelings alone, while the ones devoted to the voluntary action are governed at the same time by understanding and reason, being those who are in charge of speech and who do speak. I love his journal of spiritual experiences. It's so much intense data, and that touches on his idea of the grand human, or that all people who've made it into heaven connect with a certain part of the body, and that he's actually getting his lungs controlled by angels in heaven and all that stuff. So if it's your first time tuning into the show, welcome. That's what you're in for. But there you see this intense connection between spirit and breathing, even to the point that the spiritual world could influence his breathing, have communication with his involuntary breathing, all that kind of stuff. All right, so that's one. The other one that he talked about tangibly was thought focus, or what he was doing with his thoughts would affect spiritual experiences and could induce them. And we heard one earlier when earlier in the show, he was concentrating on something and that happened. Here's another account of that from True Christianity 112. Once I woke up just after first light. I went out into the garden in front of my house and watched the sun rising in its splendor. There was a halo around it, at first very subtle, but later on more definite, shining as though it was made of gold. Beneath the sun's rim, I saw a cloud rising up. Mirroring the flame of the sun, it gleamed like a ruby. At that point, I fell into a meditation based on the myths of the most ancients, reflecting on how they pictured Aurora, the dawn, as having silver wings and carrying gold in her mouth. Mentally taking great pleasure in these sights, I came into my spirit. So what he was thinking about induced this, because he was out, the sun's rising, I'm gonna check it out. Oh, you know how there's those myths about Aurora and how that, bam, he's in the other world. So, and there's a lot more in Swedenborg about how he manages thoughts to kind of get there. However, you have to really comb through Swedenborg to get that. He wrote 30 volumes, depending on how it's translated, tons of material, and he just very rarely talks about how to do this stuff. And I think that the main reason for that is that to him, after learning as much as he did, he realized the most important thing we can do is personal growth. I mean, this is trying to become a nicer, better, wiser person. And learning about this stuff is important, but really, some people are going to pierce the veil. Some people maybe aren't going to be able to do that in this life, but we can still gain movement. In Divine Providence 296, he says, we need to realize that all of us in spirit are in some community in the spiritual world, in a hellish one if we're evil, and a heavenly one if we're good. And he says elsewhere that we move around in life depending on what we're up to. Sometimes we are even visible there when we are deep in meditation. Further, just as sound and speech spread through the air in the physical world, desire and thought spread out in the communities in the spiritual world. There's a correspondential relationship here because desire answers to sound and thought to speech. So the takeaway there is that, there's a lot of takeaways you could potentially, but for this show, the idea is that we're in communities and we can move, based on what we're doing. So even your spirit is moving, even if you're not seeing the spiritual world. It's based on what you love and what kind of person you are. So the nicer you are, the further your spirit can move into heaven while you're here. So that can be done by anybody. Doesn't matter if you can see amazing things and float out of your body or that kind of stuff. Love moves us up, and we're all going to get our chance one day to see it anyway, right? I mean, everyone's going to go there and get more of it than you could ever dream of seeing this other world. So I'm just trying to say, we're talking all about these spiritual experiences. If you haven't had any, that's all right. You're still cool. I haven't had one. Nothing that overt like that. Like these people are describing. Had some stuff that seems a little on the edge, but not, we're still cool. We're cool. All right. We're still participating in life. All right. So that said, we do want to learn as much as we can from people who are having these experiences. Right? So let's take a look now at how are people doing this in science? How are we researching this stuff? Let's take a look at part 5. Yeah, so we dropped the acronym thing. That's all right, man. It's okay to do that. It's okay to just be you. All right, so this is one of the things I really want to get at with this show. If this stuff is happening so much, can we learn more about it? Are people cataloging this? Are people investigating into this? So we're going to hear from each of our 3 guests about this. First of all, Erica HYATT talking a little bit about some research that's going on.
Take, for example, Sam Parnia's AWARE study. This is out of New York. He's actually trying to measure what happens when people come into the emergency room when they have no heartbeat and when their brains supposedly have shut down. He's actually trying to see what happens in those moments when people are clinically dead, if they're able to experience consciousness. And how Sam Parnia's done it is by hanging pictures that can only be viewed from the ceiling, looking down. So if you were out of your body at a time where all the medical indicators suggest that you are dead, would you be able to, when you come back, if you come back, would you be able to tell us what you saw from the ceiling? And would that be a way of scientifically proving that when you were near death or at death, that something else was happening beyond your body?
And if you guys have been watching the show for any serious length of time, you'll know that Dr. HYATT is involved in some research herself. We had an episode where the great Raymond Moody and they're working on a project together. They came on. You can click here and watch it, and that's about some current research they're doing. And actually, spoiler alert, on this very channel, we're going to be getting a presentation about that in a couple of weeks. So there's that, and then next, let's move on to Graham Nichols, and he has written a book about the science around out-of-body experiences. In the description, you can find information for him and for Richard Smoley if you want to hear more from any of them. But I asked him, what's the state of the current research, and this is what he had to say.
Okay, well, I think the science is actually very strong. There's a range of different research, from reincarnation research done by Ian Stevenson and now Jim Tucker, who's continued that work, especially in children. So cases of people having memories from past experiences. It's interesting that many of the reincarnation cases seem to be related to that person died unexpectedly, or there's some reason that they needed to come back to continue things. So I don't know if those experiences fully confirm the idea that everyone reincarnates. It might be more suggestive that some people reincarnate for a particular purpose. So that's kind of an interesting area of research. Then there's the near-death experience research. An important distinction there is prospective studies, where they go out to actually look at all of the cases of near-death experiences for a period of time at a particular hospital or series of hospitals. And what they find nearly in every single study are cases of people having out-of-body experiences at the point of cardiac arrest, looking down at themselves and observing accurate information about the environment. And that's pretty much consistent across the board. A researcher called Janice Holden did a review of all of the research into near-death experiences and found that 92% of them are veridical or objectively accurate. So the things that people see while out of body are later confirmed. So unfortunately, it's not widely known about in mainstream science, because I think many scientists simply assume that there's nothing to it, or they just haven't got much of an interest in the subject. But the scientists that do look into it, they'll find strong evidence in the near-death experience research. And then also when you go into the laboratory experiments, into what's generally called psi, which is more of a neutral term. People don't like to use terms like psychic, so they use the term psi to refer to these things. And when they look into that kind of research, again, you find strong statistical evidence for things like telepathy and remote viewing or clairvoyance, which is very similar to Swedenborg's experience, where he saw the fire in another city in Sweden.
What he's referring to there is known as the Stockholm Fire. It's recorded in many areas. We have a little blurb of it. This is the Wikipedia entry, but it's in real places too. The story goes like this. In brief, Swedenborg lived in Stockholm. He was in another city a couple 100 miles away. He was at a dinner. A lot of people were there. He started to look really worried. People said to Swedenborg, "Hey man, what's the deal with you? Why are you so worried right now?" And he said, "There's a fire in Stockholm." And they said, "What?" Because there was no telephones then. There's no way for him to know something. So obviously they didn't, what's he talking about? No. Then a couple hours later, he was like, okay, well, it stopped 3 houses away from mine because his house almost got burned up. And so a few days later, word came in, hey, there was a giant fire in Stockholm and it happened exactly as he described it. Or that's how the story goes. Anyway, sorry, back to Graham.
So those kinds of experiences seem to be well established now through hundreds of institutions, through peer-reviewed journals. I've taken part in some of those experiments myself, and also organised some with Rupert Sheldrake in the UK. So I think now we're at a point that really it's more for ideological reasons that the mainstream science community has not accepted these things. I think that once the ideologies start to crumble and we start to get more open-minded people of new generations coming through, I think eventually these things will become a part of accepted science.
That's exciting. I mean, this idea that it doesn't have to be this fringe stuff, that we can actually be looking into this life after death stuff, this spiritual world stuff, through the main legit channels we look at everything else through. I think that that's cool. And I was talking to Richard Smoley further about this, and he had some more thoughts on why is there this sort of unwillingness to look at it right now in science and in general, and sort of the problems that presents. So here's what he had to say about it.
All of these experiences show something quite different, which is that the mind can, and in some cases does, survive perfectly well without the body. A lot of common descriptions of this experience are even a sense of liberation, being freed from the body, from being, as the poet Yeats put it, fastened to a dying animal. So this is very, very important. and science doesn't really know what to do with it. The usual tactic has been to explain it away. They'll usually say something that says, these experiences are anecdotal. What does that mean? Well, they happened once and you can't repeat them in a laboratory. Well, unfortunately, that doesn't really work very well because practically all of human experience is anecdotal. The whole of human history is also anecdotal. So you can't just say, well, because we can't replicate this in a lab under some kind of fairly controlled conditions, it doesn't mean anything to us. It's just fallacious. Nevertheless, this is one way of explaining it away. They really have an enormous amount of difficulty dealing with these experiences and saying that the mind can and sometimes does function when the brain doesn't seem to be working at all. Another tactic that's often used in this line is to say, well, particularly with religious experiences, well, there are certain brain states that we equate with an experience of God. That is to say, certain brain states that correlate with mystical experience. They claim, I don't know how true it is, that you could even, to some extent, stimulate these artificially with electrodes and so on. So the fact is that by this view, the argument is that our experience of God is just a brain state that has no correlation to any reality out there, wherever out there actually happens to be. This doesn't work too well either because, well, if you have a part of the brain that's kind of wired to experience something, you have a fairly good reason for believing that that something exists. To put it another way, there are parts of the brain that are set up, very elaborately set up, to recognize and process the experience of light, plain old ordinary light, right? Our experience of light, vision, is a brain state too, about which they know a fair amount. But we don't, from that, conclude that light is merely a brain state, that it has no real existence out there. Of course, you get even further into it, is that, well, by your own theory, everything is a brain state. So, of course, even your own reasoning process by which you're saying this is a brain state is also a brain state. And why this should have any real authority over the other brain states is never made clear or understood. So science is at a real impasse, and I think it has been, particularly for the last 30 years or so, for the simple reason that they know more and more about how the brain processes consciousness. And it's much more tempting now to say, well, consciousness is just brain states. And standard, neurology, psychology is all but says that. And they can't say it flatly because they don't know how the brain produces consciousness. There is no model of any sort produced by anyone, and they will admit this and say so, that we have no idea how the brain produces something we call consciousness. And they don't seem any closer to it than they were 2,000 years ago in a way. Well, we do know certain things affect brain states, and certain chemicals affect brain states, but the first man who ever got drunk figured that one out. So it's at a real impasse, and a lot of it, I think there's an enormous amount of denial there. It strays into the area, as you can imagine, of religion, and scientists don't want to touch that because it's not, strictly speaking, a scientific area. And that's all well and good, but the fact is, it's one thing to say, well, it's not something we can talk about as scientists, but they seem to go a little further than that because there's a smug kind of background assumption that therefore we know these things don't really exist. And that is a major impasse that the culture faces because the major, shall we say, repository of knowledge, the major source of knowledge, at least as conventionally understood, is science. And science doesn't want to talk about these things. It would prefer that they didn't exist and pretends that they don't exist.
So there you have it. And the very last part of that, he talked about how that sort of denial to even look into it is harming society. That we actually are not getting some of the spiritual nourishment we need because we're not checking into this with our primary checking into mechanism, which is science. So Graham had similar or thoughts in the same sort of vein, and when I was talking with him about why are these spiritual phenomena, these experiences, ignored or tried, or people try to explain them away so often, and he had these thoughts about it.
I think that a lot of it is to do with a fear that it's a backdoor to religion, and that they're kind of scared of that, a lot of people, so they don't want to accept the evidence. But the evidence is so much stronger than the evidence for many things out there. The last meta-analysis that was done, for example, came back with stronger evidence for precognition, for example, than the evidence for the Higgs boson particle that was recently confirmed in CERN. So it's kind of interesting because the data is so strong, but then when I've debated skeptics myself, they'll just say, oh, but the quality of the evidence is not good enough. But then there was a recent study of the quality of parapsychological evidence, and it was actually found that the standards in parapsychology are higher than they are in mainstream psychology and in other areas of science. So many of these things are just prejudice, really. It's just a denial of things because you don't personally like the idea that they exist.
And I never thought of it that way before, that, something like Higgs boson, we've discovered a particle. It does exist. We know it exists. That's something real. These anecdotes of near-death experiences, or being able to know if somebody's calling you on the phone, who it is, if you've heard of that's something that's sort of, it's not really proven. But that Graham's saying that actually there's more evidence and the studies are cleaner and better for that stuff, but still it's got this sort of stigma around it, like that stuff is not really real. So hopefully in the future, we'll be able to just hold this stuff neutrally. That if the evidence is pointing towards there's something else out there, then let's go for it. Anyway, that to come for maybe my generation, the generation below. Who knows? Maybe next year could happen, right? If you guys have been enjoying this conversation about these kinds of things, please like and subscribe. I know it's a lot of work, but if you click those little buttons there, that makes a big difference to us. It makes YouTube think we're more worthwhile, gets this conversation, these ideas out to a larger audience. So really appreciate subscribing if you haven't already, liking. If you liked the video, don't do it to pad our stats if you thought we phoned this one in. All right, we're going to take your live questions now. Let's get a quick video break and then we'll get into it. All right, thanks for hanging in there. Let's see what you guys are thinking about. I'd love to get your perspective on the conversation. Let's take a look at our first question or comment. Duchess753, does Swedenborg say anything about speaking in tongues? Oh man, so Duchess is referring to, there's a practice in, I think it's a Christian thing, right? Where you suddenly are overcome and you just start talking in a language that no one's ever heard and that you've never spoken in before. Let's see. There's not major references to it. Swedenborg will talk, as we saw earlier in this episode, about unintelligible, like the angels are saying things that you can't understand. He could only bring a bit of it back into regular, everyday human language. And actually, if you look at our Raymond Moody episode, that I pointed to earlier, they are talking about how people who are getting close to death speak unintelligibly, like they say things that don't make sense, but it may have meaning. But that's generally sticking with their language. Swedenborg does say there is a language of the spirit that is widely known, that as soon as you shed the body, you instinctively know that it's sort of the root ideas that we all think about, those expressed, and whether that could be the speaking in tongues. But as far as it being, I don't think he would say that when it was prophesied that people would speak in tongues, that it's a literal thing like that. It's more about, I'd have to look up this specific reference, but it's more about how you understand things and can grasp truth. So those are my thoughts on the subject. And that's final. Okay, so thanks very much for the question. It's a good one. Sorry I couldn't answer it better. Lee, YouTube. Did Swedenborg talk with Enoch, Moses, Isaiah? Ooh, yeah. Swedenborg certainly isn't scared to make references to specific people from, people from like Socrates, those kinds of people, but also people who were in the Bible. And now you're going to expose some holes in my knowledge, because I know that he talked to like Paul, the Apostle Paul. I know he had experiences with David, seeing David. As far as the prophet Isaiah, Moses, or Enoch, I don't know if he had. Moses, I know he talked about people wanting in the next life who show up and want to dine with Moses, and that actually actors came and pretended they were Moses to show them what that would be like. But I don't know if he had experiences with those ones. If you, go to, find Swedenborg's books, search in the word Moses. Swedenborg has indexes, that kind of thing. You could probably find it, but I don't, no specifics with those three guys come to mind. Okay, over 2. Let's see what our next question is. FCO GZA. Swedenborg says, thought brings presence, and that also love brings you near angels of your community that have similar love of you, even still being in the natural world. So would it be possible to be close to my girlfriend that is since 1 month ago in the spiritual world? Meaning she could feel my love for her, or can I feel her in some way if I'm thinking in her so much and with the same love of her? So that's, first of all, sorry for that loss. If she just died a month ago, that must be really, really powerful and really fresh still. So I'm sorry, and I appreciate you being willing to share that. And I mean, how could it not? I would imagine that people that cross over can still have that connection. If you guys are still feeling that, Swedenborg says we're in the spiritual world right now as far as our spirits are. And so if your spirit is really still feeling that connection, it's still going out, I can't imagine that wouldn't bring the two of you together. And you do get when people have near-death experiences, the people that they've known and loved in life are usually the first ones to meet them there. So I would say that, yeah, I mean, I'm not the guy who knows for sure, but I think so. I mean, doesn't that seem right? And it seems to be what's indicated by the way Swedenborg described it. So again, sorry for your loss, and thanks for talking, and I hope you feel a connection to her. And I'd say just talk like you're feeling like she's there, and I think that it'll get through. So that's my opinion on it. Thanks. All right, let's look at our next YouTube. Rocky Soul. Is the spirit world in the 4th dimension? Swedenborg says some atmospheres are made of playing children. Yes, he did. Yes, he did say some atmospheres are made of playing children. There's a short video we did called The Air in Heaven, where he describes atmospheres, made of microscopic flowers, made of children at play. Check out that. And also we did a longer episode on it, 8 strange, I think 8 strange places in the afterlife. As far as the spirit world being in the 4th dimension, I don't know. Swedenborg says that the physical world and the spiritual world are completely distinct, as in they're not on a continuum, as in you can't go somewhere, you can't go up or down or something in the physical world and reach the spiritual world, and you can't zoom out past the edge of the solar system and you'll get there. However, as far as what some people call the 4th dimension time, so that it wouldn't be that by that definition. But as far as how that actual link happens, I know that people who are studying quantum mechanics, that kind of thing, the things on the smallest scale are saying there could be as many as 10 or 11 dimensions all curled up. I don't get what that means, but could that one of those be? Is that the way the connection to the spiritual world happens? The answer, as it always is, I don't know. But those are a few of my thoughts on it. Okay, let's take a look at the next one. Barb, does Swedenborg ever talk about healing? That's an interesting question, because you do hear. I remember once somebody saying that they had come across someone who knew Swedenborg, and they'd come across another book about someone who was telling their experiences of the afterlife, and they sort of said this is like the new an update of Heaven and Hell, the book, and it focused a lot on healing. And you certainly hear in spiritual experiences about healing. I once was told that that a green blanket was put on me by my sister who had died because I needed healing from it in spirit. So it does seem like healing matters, and isn't healing sort of the expression of love that we have. In Swedenborg, it seems like the way that you heal, there's a sort of emotional wounds, but the deeper healing is getting rid of the negative elements and learning the truth. The truth heals. We find that in situations, some people think they have no value, but the truth about their value and about how we all have this place in the great thing can be really healing. One of the reasons I'm sitting here hanging around Swedenborg stuff is that I find healing in the concepts. And obviously it's not just Swedenborg, these other people are reporting it too, but to that is healing to me. And also when you have near-death experiences, people talk about being in this light and getting this amazing emotional experience. So there's that healing that happens. And then physically, Swedenborg, and I'm just going to barely touch on this, but Swedenborg does say that negative influences can be associated with disease and you can get rid of those. And even though you do need to heal through physical means, anyway, that's another episode right there. Okay, great question. Thanks. We got two more. Let's get to them. P. Hoffman, you open your show with a statement about people wanting proof of God's existence. Which book of Swedenborg is the best to give a non-believer? Oh, man. Really, any of Swedenborg's are going to be a stretch because he wasn't really designing them at an atheistic mindset. There are certainly segments where he goes at that, but none of them from start to finish are like, here's a pamphlet, because in his time there was atheism, but the society was so Christian dominated that his readership was generally that. There are definitely segments. Someone could easily put together a book that was about that. That said, Divine Love and Wisdom might be a good one, because that's the one where he least often is, leaning on or citing the Bible as evidence, that he's just kind of appealing to philosophy and rationality. So that could be it. But I'd say if you're going to give something to someone, vet it a little bit first, take a look. That would be a good, compilation project for the Swedenborg Foundation or some other organization. Swedenborg's message to people because he one thing is, a lot of the arguments atheists make against religion, Swedenborg makes those as well. He says, if there weren't these secrets locked inside the text of the Bible, why would it matter how big a temple was supposed to be, or whether or not you killed a ram, or also when he says, if God really wanted to take revenge, what kind of God is that? So he has the same kind of complaints that atheists do. I often find that he writes a lot like you see modern atheists writing. So there's a couple of thoughts on that. Thanks very much. Good luck with that if you're going to give a book to somebody. And that's it. I just got word our last question dropped off the face of the planet. They probably saw how I answered the other ones and were like, no thanks, man. Okay, so thanks everyone for hanging out. If you had fun here and you want to continue or want to consider making this kind of thing continue, please consider making a donation. We have a grant, so it'll be matched 5-1. If you want to do $20 for a year, you'll get a membership. You get some bonuses for that. It helps support this kind of programming, which we give out free to everyone. Excuse me, I get so choked up talking about donations. So anyway, if you want to think about it, that would be cool. Appreciate you guys hanging out, making this show possible. And if you want to hang out next week, you can. We're going to talk about auras. Yeah, so don't bring your non-believer friend to the next show, because we're going to start talking about auras. Actually, they might think it's cool. Everyone's welcome. We're going to talk about some of the specifics of those, how they work, what the heck are they, what does Swedenborg say about them. So if that sounds fun, join us next Monday. Thank you very much, and I'll see you then.